Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us today. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I am the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies. I'd like to welcome all of you today on this special day for the United Kingdom, the final goodbye to Queen Elizabeth, for an event that we organized today in cooperation with our Center for British Studies and also the Anglo-American Law and Policy Program. We welcome today to Moses Hall Matt Beech, who's the founding director of the Center for British Politics and also reader in politics in the Department of Political Science at the University of Hull. In 2017, Matt was a visiting scholar here at our institute at the Center for British Studies. And we're proud and honored to have Matt with us as a team in our team of senior fellows here at the Institute of European Studies. So welcome back, Matt. Always wonderful to have you with us. Professor Beech will speak for about 30-40 minutes, and after his lecture, we will have an opportunity for Q&A, both with the people here with us today in person in Moses Hall, but also with those who are following us today on Zoom. The lecture Professor Beech prepared for us today is entitled British Politics After Boris Johnson. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Matt Beech.
My thanks go to my friend and colleague, Professor Jeroen de Wolf. My thanks are also to colleagues who've helped and supported me whilst I've been at Berkeley, Professor Mark Levere and Mr. Brad Barber. So my thanks to the IES and the Centre for British Studies and the Anglo-American Law and Policy Programme. It's wonderful to be back here at Cal, wonderful to be back amongst friends. Great to see everybody online, as well as folks here in the room. I'm sure it has not escaped your attention that several hours ago in Westminster Abbey, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, a funeral service took place in front of His Royal Highness King Charles III, the royal family, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, His Majesty's government, Commonwealth leaders and dignitaries from across the globe. 2,000 people were in attendance in Westminster Abbey, and an estimated 4.1 billion people watched the broadcast. By my very rudimentary math, that's approximately half the world's population. After the procession of the coffin on the state gun carriage by 142 naval ratings, and flanked by guards, regiments and soldiers of, amongst others, the household cavalry, the King, Princess Royal, Duke of York, the Earl of Wessex, the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Sussex, followed Her Majesty's coffin, which made its final stage of journey to where it was carried off in the royal hearse to Windsor Castle, where she was buried in St. George's Chapel. This, in a ceremonial, formal and cultural sense, friends, concludes the second Elizabethan era. I watched the broadcast live at 2 a.m. Pacific Coast time, and I listened to the BBC World Service in the wee small hours. This lecture was planned several months ago, and in a sense, part of me does not quite know whether it's fitting to be talking about partisan politics when my countrymen are taking part in a huge historic event where there is a public holiday and there are no universities teaching and no schools, and they are marking with honor and respect the passing of our longest serving monarch. Moreover, parliamentary politics in the United Kingdom is temporarily suspended. And yet, we are gathered here. And I decided to catch that flight to California. And So I've decided to shape and sculpt my remarks in what I hope is a dignified manner befitting of the day and the hour at hand. British politics after Boris Johnson. The Conservative Party have been in office for 12 years. They have won the last 4 general elections, 2010, 15, 17, and 19. In that time, they've had 4 leaders, and the country has had 4 prime ministers, including its 2nd and 3rd female prime ministers. The 12 years are remembered for many things. An austerity phase in the wake of the global financial crisis, where lots of cuts to public services occurred. Coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, first time the Liberal Democrats, as the Liberal Democrats, were in office. The 2016 EU membership referendum, minority government status, parliamentary gridlock, confidence and supply agreements with the Northern Irish Democratic Unionist Party, called for a 2nd Scottish independence referendum, constitutional crises, the 2019 landslide victory for Boris Johnson's Conservatives, the rise of Labour's left under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour's loss of the red wall seats, formal withdrawal from the European Union in January 2020, COVID-19, Partygate, Her Majesty's Diamond and Platinum Jubilees, and as I've just said, Her Majesty's passing in the end of the second Elizabethan era. Boris Johnson resigned as leader of the Tory party in July of this year, and yet remained in office as Prime Minister. And after a summer of campaigning, the Conservative leadership election took place, and there were hustings, and there were debates televised and on radio. And Liz Truss, Elizabeth Truss, was elected by 57% of the membership of the Conservative Party, which totals around about 170,000 people, not a very large electorate. Though she was not initially the preferred candidate of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, the elite of the Tory party, the MPs. Liz Truss is the MP for South West Norfolk and entered the Commons in 2010. She served in the last 3 Conservative governments and has a decade of experience. Experience at the Education Department as a junior minister, Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Justice Department, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, International Trade Secretary, and most recently, Foreign Secretary. Now, friends, I think this is significant. It tells us something about Liz Truss. It tells us that she is sufficiently pragmatic to serve in 3 quite different Conservative administrations. It tells us that she, like the vast majority of MPs, is ambitious and sought ministerial responsibility. It also tells us she's highly competent and diligent, being promoted to larger and more significant ministerial briefs as her career progressed. Unlike her predecessor, went from being Foreign Secretary to Prime Minister. So she has international name recognition amongst other leaders. But alongside her pragmatism, I think it's fair to say, like most interesting politicians, like most politicians of substance, certainly in British politics, she is an ideologue. And I don't use that term in a disparaging sense. All best leaders are engaged in ideas and are part of ideological and ideational traditions. Liz Truss is no different. Truss, to my estimation, is what we in the United Kingdom call an economic liberal. In America, you would prefer the term fiscal conservative. She's an advocate of free market economics, free trade agreements, growing the private sector, fewer regulations, and a lower overall tax burden as the necessary ingredients for both a free economy and thus a free society, one which is best placed to produce wealth. She co-authored 2 books as a young new MP after the coalition and Britannia Unchained. Co-authored them with the likes of Priti Patel, Dominic Raab and others, her peer group, others who've been sufficiently pragmatic and also ideological and have had notable parliamentary careers. Both of those books were a rallying cry, A, to push away from the Liberal Democrats. Interestingly, Liz Truss was a member of the Lib Dems up until 1996, but what we would probably call the free market, right-wing Lib Dem, Orange Book Liberal, but also an argument for moving away from a larger state, a state that was willing to intervene in the economy. So this is a politician who is a pragmatist and also ideological. She's a politician who is operating within intellectual traditions and believes in persuasion and putting those ideas in print. Truss, while a pragmatist, as I said, is an economic liberal, and I would say the influence of Mrs. Thatcher is apparent. Also, Truss was a Remainer. In other words, she campaigned and voted to remain in the European Union in the 2016 referendum, not dissimilar to Mrs. Thatcher in 1975 in the Common Market referendum. Why? Well, I guess like the Thatcher of the 1970s, rather than the Thatcher of the late 1980s, who pivoted with her Bruges speech and very much became sceptical of what was then by that stage the social Europe project, a kind of more social democratic, progressive approach to try and tie the European Union into a set of economic and social rights and protections and make them mandatory for member states. That's what Mrs. Thatcher then pushed against. Mrs. Thatcher, like Liz Truss, was economically in favour of the Club of Nations as a means by which to grow Britain's economy through trade with other advanced capitalist nations. But after the Brexit referendum, as we call it, the pragmatist Liz Truss quite understandably said, I'm going to get on board with the future. And she was appointed Minister for International Trade and signed a large amount of trade deals, connecting her belief in free trade and free markets. Like most Conservative MPs of her generation, she is liberal on matters of social issues and personal morality. She was a member of the Lib Dems, as I've just alluded to. And yet her liberalism is distinct from progressivism. Truss, as Equalities Minister, was not an advocate of what people might call woke politics. She was a believer in equality of opportunity, of meritocracy, of treating people as individuals, as opposed to focusing on group politics and identitarian narratives. This is not a prime minister that thinks in the United Kingdom is either institutionally racist, institutionally sexist, nor a force for ill in the world. Not at all. There will be no place for critical race theory and other ideological ancillaries of different types of Marxist politics in a Truss government. So whilst a liberal on social and perhaps moral matters, that does not mean a progressive, it does not mean influenced by leftist cultural and social agenda. This Prime Minister has just stood up in Westminster Abbey and has just read from the New Testament in honour of her monarch who believed that Jesus Christ was her personal saviour. So it tells you a little bit about the Prime Minister. Not all Prime Ministers would have been comfortable doing that. This Prime Minister took the oath and pledged allegiance to God. Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, a convinced atheist, like the last three leaders of the Labour Party, did not take the oath, but affirmed commitment to the Constitution and to Parliament. These things you might think, oh, well, they might just be little cultural differences. But I think they tell you something about the politics and the ideological direction of individuals. A picture I hope is emerging of Truss, the person, the politician, and now the King's First Minister. Now, did you see what I did then? I mentioned First Minister. So we often perhaps think of Scotland as in the Scottish First Minister. So Truss, like Johnson before her, I don't believe will countenance a second Scottish independence referendum. not since one has very recently been held within 8 years. I might add that the recent focus on Scotland in Her Majesty's final days, her time in Balmoral, her deep love of Scotland, and the dignifying of Scotland in Her Majesty's kind of perspective, perhaps has strengthened the argument that Scotland should remain part of the EU, as part of the UK. And I think that rubs with what the Scottish National Party are seeking. They want to be a constitutional monarchy. They want Scotland to be independent and be a constitutional monarchy, whilst being outside of the Union of the United Kingdom. But there are continuities, friends, and discontinuities that have already emerged. One of the continuities, I think, is the attitude towards Truss and her government regarding Ukraine. Don't forget she was Foreign Secretary under Boris Johnson. Military and financial support will continue. The United Kingdom being one of the most forthright and most vocal supporters of Ukraine against Russian aggression will, I believe, continue. There are also other continuities as well. I think perhaps the next most apparent one is Truss's commitment to the special relationship or the Atlantic Alliance with the United States. Every Prime Minister has to have that approach to the most vital, free and democratic nation on God's earth. Truss is a convinced Atlanticist, sits within the tradition of NATO, sits within the tradition of economic partnerships between democracies and free market economies. And she mixes pragmatic acknowledgement that often British interests are not aligned with the interests of the United States, but that Britain has to have good, robust relationships with the world's leading superpower. I think another continuity is around the Northern Irish Protocol and Northern Irish politics in general. Continuity with what the Conservatives have done up until now in the commitment to reform the Northern Irish Protocol, to accept a lot of the criticisms of unionists, especially the DUP, aware of the gridlock that is currently in Stormont, having Sinn Féin won for the first time a majority in Stormont, and are keen to get back to governing. The difficulty is the DUP aren't playing ball because they refuse to get behind an election of the Speaker until the protocol is sorted out. This protocol, from the European Union's perspective, is a clear agreement and there won't be any reneging on it. I think Truss, like Johnson, is going to continue at the level of ideas and rhetoric, an argument that suggests that exemptions and special cases have to be made for the sake not just of economic trade, but also for the sake of stability in Northern Ireland and the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. But I think also there are, I think also there are discontinuities. And I think the most significant discontinuity between Truss and Johnson, between the current Conservative government and the last one, is over the energy crisis and is over the national insurance contribution rise of Rishi Sunak. This is going to be reversed. The energy price cap is also coming into play next month, probably to a cost of between $1 billion and $2 billion. Now you might say that's a lot of money, that's a lot of intervention, that's a kind of lot of price fixing for an economic liberal, and I think that's right, it is. But the argument was, on the one hand, a windfall tax advocated by Sir Keir Starmer, or a way to try and encourage investment by energy companies, but provide the absolutely vital relief to individuals and households, individuals and families who are facing, in many cases, the doubling or more of energy bills, and in the lead up to winter, because of the the Russian war in Ukraine. Also, a discontinuity is tax cuts. These are being very strongly discussed by Kwasi Kwarteng, the new Chancellor. Tax cuts, I think, in terms of direct but also indirect taxation. This is a clear discontinuity. And what for the second great party of state, the Labour Party, led by Sir Keir Starmer? Well, I think also there's a continuity here. Labour has a 15% poll lead. This is very significant. They've been out of power for 12 years. This is midterm for this Conservative government. The general election is 2 years away. And Boris Johnson was very unpopular with the public over Partygate, scandals, accusations that he had misled the country. And yet Labour's position with Truss, in one sense, is secure. This is the same Conservative government. They face the same problems about 11% inflation, the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis. And yet, I think from Labour's point of view, they would have preferred Johnson to stay in power because he, in one sense, he's more of a polarizing figure. He's perhaps a better campaigner than Liz Truss. He's certainly a better orator than Liz Truss on the campaign trail. I think Labour would have preferred, and Sir Keir Starmer would have preferred, Johnson to stay in place. The Conservatives had a small window of opportunity, probably for the next month or two, for Liz Truss to sculpt and shape a slightly different message, to hit the ground running, to provide tax relief, to provide relief on people's energy costs, and to try and move outside of the narrative that the Labour Party have framed, quite understandably, around the Conservative Party, which is, you know, they say one thing, but they do another. They talk a good game, but their actions belie their words. By 2024, Labour will have been out of office for 14 years, and inflation is running at a record high for the generation, for the last generation, and since the 1990s. The key thing, I think, for Liz Truss is to be able to show that she has a clear and different agenda from Boris Johnson. Johnson was an instinctive spender, let alone COVID, and we have to put that to one side, I think, to some extent, when 300+ billion pounds was spent on grants to businesses, helping folk, basically government paying people during the lockdowns when they couldn't go out. And yet Liz Truss has to try and build a narrative very quickly. And it's a very difficult juggling act. She has to say there's a grounds for intervening in the economy with this cost of energy, cost of living crisis and the energy crisis, and at the same time say why she is not for what she would say is more sort of punitive taxation against energy companies who she wants to stay and invest. So it's a very difficult path to walk. And I think she's got a very limited amount of window of opportunity. I think Labour are in pretty good shape. But the thing that I will leave you with, and I'll conclude here, and I'll take questions. The thing that I will leave you with is whether British politics after Boris Johnson is like the early 1990s or the late 1990s. If it's the late 1990s, you have a Labour leader who is trying to be economically moderate, certainly compared to a previous Labour leader, facing a Conservative government that had been in power for well over a decade, winning many elections. Or whether it's actually a bit like the early 1990s. In other words, facing a government that had been in power for a long time, but with a relatively new leader, a leader who is not as charismatic as their predecessor, a leader who is a bit more businesslike. And in that election in 1992, Labour had a significant lead. Kinnock had a personal lead over Major in the personal ratings. And the phenomenon of shy Toryism came to the fore. Tory's majority was reduced, significantly reduced. But they won a fourth term. Is this the early or the late 1990s? I think in the coming weeks, we'll have a clearer sense. I will just also say that all the images today have been used under Creative Commons 3.0 license and have been taken either from the Parliament website or Downing Street website or the White House website. They're all used under Creative Commons. Thank you very much, friends. I'd like to take your questions now. Thanks so much.